it is very easy to tell when an essay has been written by AI.
I'm not looking for the best academic person. I'm looking for someone who can handle the academics, but who has the leadership potential to make my school proud as an alumnus or an alumna.
There is some charm in an imperfect personal statement. Once you're at that MBA program, all of the schools are going to work exceptionally hard to do what they can to get you there, to provide you with a really great experience. They understand the broader world, and you will have a fantastic experience within the four walls of the campus.
I think people who are new to the process severely underestimate the importance of likability. So it's not just about feeling human or seeming human through your essay, but actually becoming likable.
The more thoughtful I think admissions setups are, the better they're going to be able to tailor classes to exactly what it is that they want from students. MBA admissions will be completely different in 2025. That's not surprising because everything is different in 2025. Is it going to be a tough year? Are applications going to be more competitive? On this, our maiden voyage of the new GMAT Club podcast, we'll be talking about some of the most important changes so that you can have an idea about what to expect as you build this year's MBA application. I'm Brian Fobi, founder of GuruFi.com, and my co-host is Maria Wich-Vila, founder of Applicant Lab. And today we're going to be talking about the changing landscape of MBA admissions and how and whether it should change your thoughts on applying for an MBA. How are you doing today, Maria?
I'm doing great, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing great. You're in Los Angeles, right?
I sure am.
Yeah, I'm in sunny, beautiful Minneapolis, together by the wonders of the internet. So GMAT Club put out a poll, and they basically asked the users about some of the things that they were concerned about for the upcoming application year. And in some ways, like my timeline as a person who works in this business, and probably you're the same way, is a little bit like a lot of the students. Like we've just gone through about a month ago, the very end of the application season, and you sort of take a couple of weeks to have the hoodie and sweatpants decompression. And then you sort of move into preparing for the next year of applications. And so we've started to look forward and figuring out what's going to be different. And a lot of people who are applying for next year, that is, they're applying this year for 2026, have also started to think about what's different. And one of the common things that has come up is the new GMAT, how it's different, how they should think about it, especially with respect to the GRE and maybe which one to choose, strengths and weaknesses of each, maybe changes in approaches and emphasis. Do you have initial thoughts on the GMAT question?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So for people who may not be familiar with the entire GMAT landscape, what happened is that about a year and a half ago, GMAT responded to a lot of complaints from applicants saying the test is too hard, it's too long, it's taking forever. And over the past sort of 15 to 20 years, GMAT has been losing a tremendous amount of market share to the GRE. So when I applied to business school over 20 years ago, you could get accepted with the GRE, but I would estimate that maybe less than 10% of applicants were actually submitting it. GMAT took the lion's share. It was the go-to test, essentially the default test for applying to business school. What's happened over the subsequent 10, 15, 20 years is that GRE has been encroaching and taking a ton of market share away from GMAT by positioning itself as perhaps a quote-unquote easier test. And I also think that anecdotally, those of us in admissions would see that very strong candidates who were incredibly strong across every other dimension except for the test score, when they would submit sort of a lower than average GMAT score, they might not get accepted. But if they submitted a lower than average GRE score, there seemed to be a little bit more forgiveness and leeway there. And so I think that rumor sort of, it kind of became known as like a hack, a backdoor hack for people who don't do well in tests to get accepted. But unfortunately, everyone started finding out about the hack. And now what's happening is that, the GRE is like, 33% or if not more of the tests that are being submitted. So what did GMAT do? Well, they very understandably said, well, how can we change our tests to make it more test taker friendly? They went to the schools, they went to test takers, they spent all this time revamping the test. And in a short version, the test is now, it's shorter, more user-friendly, right? What's not to love? They got rid of the writing part of it. They got rid of some of the more difficult verbal sections. And then they announced it triumphantly to the market. And The only problem is that in my opinion, they spent so much time thinking about how to make the input better, that is, how to make the test experience better, that they then didn't put nearly as much thought into the output. And one of the biggest problems with the new GMAT is that the scores, they recalibrated all of the scores in order to create a lot more level of nuance at that upper level of test performance. And in a nutshell, what happened is that it deducted almost 50 points off of a score. So for example, a while ago, or under the old system, the average score at a lot of schools would be around a 730, at least the top schools, right? Now a 730 is a 685. So even just psychologically, if I'm a test taker and I do the test and I get a 685, it doesn't sound as impressive. Like even though it is as impressive, the market has not yet been conditioned to accept these newer scores. And I'm actually concerned that on the tail end post-graduation, in the past, when people would do very well on the GMAT, they might even put their GMAT score on their resume as part of the job search. And so employers, admissions officers themselves are probably using this concordance table that GMAT, like, okay, here's the old score and here's the new score equivalents. But I don't think employers have necessarily caught on. So I'm a little bit worried that people, if they apply for a job in a couple of years, I've got a 685, you should hire me. Like a 685 to someone from my old generation doesn't necessarily sound so impressive. So poor GMAT. I think that they spent all of their energy making the test better, but not thinking about the psychology of the test score and how important that is to people's, even their emotional response to the test. So what's going to happen this year? This is going to be the first year in which we're going to have data coming out from the schools of, all right, we're accepting now the GMAT Focus Edition was what they renamed it. What is that going to mean in terms of our average scores, right? If a 685 is the new 730, is the average score still going to be a 685, or is it going to go up, or is it going to go down? And so I think it's very challenging right now, especially if someone struggles with standardized testing. It's a difficult sell to sell them on the new GMAT, because I do worry that the score will be considerably lower, and that might harm their chances.
So with respect to the GMAT versus the GRE, I know that a lot of people who prefer or are going to take the GRE, they use the concordance tables that you've talked about. The challenge, though, with the GRE is that, just like my own personal experience was, for graduate school, I took the GRE, and my program didn't even require you to do the quantitative section, but I just did it anyway because you have to sit there through it. And I got almost a perfect score, which was funny since I hadn't taken math since my sophomore year of college. And so there are parts of that test that are certainly easier. And so is there a sense, especially if you're applying to really competitive schools, that if you're trying to differentiate yourself, that there's an understanding that the top level scores for a GRE don't really mean what they mean for, a top GMAT score. And so those concordance tables, even to the extent that we can depend on the old ones, they're not really as useful as they might be, as you might think that they are.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think that the general idea has usually been that the GRE is the quote unquote easier test, especially in terms of quant. If you are, however, an excellent test taker, all else being equal, I think getting a really high score on the GMAT will serve you better in terms of admissions, just because it does continue to be the key vanity metric that I think a lot of schools use. But it's a little bit funny, like in the past, the GMAT goes up until around 800. Now it's 805. But so in the past, a 99th percentile score, there was a 50 point range. So anything from a 750 to an 800 was quote unquote 99th percentile. Now it's 715 to 805. So that spread, that level of, granularity, you're still 99. The difference between 99.1 and 99.2 percentile is essentially statistically insignificant. And yet on the actual test, it might look like you did 20 or 30 points worse. So I don't know. I think if somebody is very comfortable as a test taker, then yes, all else being equal, take the GMAT. But I think that the schools, at the end of the day, they're looking for leaders who can handle the academics, but they're not primarily basing the admissions decision on academics. So a very low test score will keep you out, because they don't want you to be miserable. If you enroll in the class in, algebra, you struggle with something like algebra, then I've got bad news for you in terms of how much you're going to enjoy business school. You might not enjoy it that much. So the schools definitely don't want to let anyone in who can't handle the work. But at a certain point, what they're looking for is leadership. And so if you're not a strong test taker, I do think that the GRE should be a very strong consideration for you.
And is there any additional advice in terms of when you think about the psychology of it? Once you disaggregate the top 2%, then there starts to be this concern of like, well, 99th percentile, 99.1 isn't good enough. I've got to get to 99.7. And I understand that, you always want to strengthen your application as much as possible. But is there a point where you say, like, this isn't going to be your area of concern? Like, this isn't the problem. It's good enough. Do you try to turn down the volume on that kind of psychological pressure?
I absolutely do. And I think, again, it'll be super interesting once this year's results come out and we actually see what are the averages and do they match up with what the old scores were in terms of those percentiles. But I actually think sometimes it backfires. If someone gets like a 99.2 percentile score and then they retake it to try to get 99.6%, I actually think it's a turnoff, right? Because then I'm thinking to myself, you clearly don't understand what I'm looking for as an admissions officer, right? This is not, again, I'm not looking for the best academic person. I'm looking for someone who can handle the academics, but who has the leadership potential to make my school proud as an alumnus or an alumna. So I actually think it's off-putting, right? If it's like, oh, come on. Like, just come on, chill out, like focus on other things. So I actually, if somebody has a high score that's say 99th or above, and in case you're wondering, like, okay, so what's the metric? I would say use the concordance table backwards and look at your target school and say, like, okay, so if under the old system, I would have been happy with 740, let me just deduct the points, and then whatever that score is, as long as I hit that score, I'll be happy with it.
Yeah, and when we think about this kind of uncertainty, as we transition to the next topic, one of the real areas of uncertainty that people are experiencing, and this was in fact the number one concern that people expressed in the poll that GMAT Club ran, was, quote, the changing situation in the United States. And this was what people identified as which MBA application trends worries them the most. Now, normally, this time of year, you have a pretty good sense of kind of what the application landscape is like. And we talked about how maybe the testing is going to be a little bit different. But there's also kind of this question of what it means to go to an MBA program in the United States. And this is very politics adjacent. I'm not going to necessarily, dive deep into the politics of it, but it has an impact on MBA admissions. And I think that the last set of data that we have that was prospective, that is polling people about what they wanted to do or what they were thinking about doing, suggested that the trends that we'd been seeing, which over the last few years had been an upward swing in the number of applicants, that might not be the case for the coming year. And it is incredibly early. All right. And so the one thing the big asterisk that I will put on this is that I've been trying to figure out what our business is going to look like next year in terms of how many people are going to be applying to MBA programs. There's an element of tea leaf reading to it. So they're like, what is the tourism data looking like? What's going on with visas? All of those things. The problem is that specifically with respect to overseas applicants to American MBA programs, all of that data looks bad to disastrous in terms of numbers. Tourism is already seeing like a 35% drop. And these are people who had made plans to come to the United States who have canceled them, sometimes at the cost of, flights and deposits and things like that. Another part of the business that I run is we have people who help people get into medical schools. And so visas is a very complicated part of that process. And I'm already experiencing what cuts in the State Department and the applications for visas for overseas people coming to the United States, which is often overlooked challenge. And so, and there are also people in the United States who are here legally who are already experiencing challenges with their visas. And so all of those things I worry are going to cause, or I wonder if they will end up causing kind of a big collapse in the number of applicants when we had, say, as recently as January, supposed that was probably going to be more by about 10 or 12% than we saw last year. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, anyone listening to this who can read the tea leaves, please contact me and tell me what stocks I should buy. and what the economy is going to do, and what the visa situation is going to be. So first of all, if we just look at the economic parts of it super quick, if we are headed into a recession, normally that's very bullish for MBA admissions, right? Whenever there's been a recession in the past, what better place to ride out that recession than in business school and wait for the storm to pass, and then you graduate as the storm is breaking, and all these opportunities are waiting for you. But as you pointed out, I think that the immigration situation has created a tremendous sense of uncertainty in terms of not only am I going to get a student visa to come in, but then once I graduate, what's going to happen to the OPT and H-1B visa program? Will I be able to stay? I'm taking out all this student debt, right? Many times, there are scholarships available for MBA programs, but there are also a lot of international students who pay full fare and who often have to take out $150,000 or more in student debt to get that MBA. Now, normally that calculation is one where you say, well, it's risky, but it's a worthwhile risk. Because if I graduate and I get that job at McKinsey or Facebook or whatever, I do the math in my head, I might be able to, paying that back will be tough, but it's doable. But now if I'm going to go through the admissions process and perhaps not be able to even attend should I get accepted, or then, not be able to stay in the country and work, earning in dollars after I graduate, now it becomes a much more dire calculation. And so I would not be surprised to see international applicant volume decrease perhaps a little, or perhaps in fact a lot. I think that your point of pointing to the tourism numbers as a canary in a coal mine is really smart, right? If people are afraid to come to the US to go on vacation, and vacation's a week, how much more frightened will they be to come and spend 2 years here or more? So I think that's a really good indicator and a smart way to think about it. What I would say, though, to international students who are concerned about, am I going to do all of this for nothing, right? Is our student visa just going to evaporate? So first of all, hopefully not. Hopefully someone somewhere will be able to speak. Elon Musk himself is an immigrant, right? So hopefully there will not be a complete evaporation of all of the international student visas, number one. But number two, what we saw during COVID, for example, which was the last time a big shock sort of hit the system, is that people, if let's say they applied and they got accepted, but for whatever reason they were unable to attend, I saw the schools being a lot more lenient than they would normally be in terms of things like deferrals. So normally, if you apply to business school, don't apply with the idea of like, well, I don't know if I want to go next year, but I'll just apply. And if I get in, then I'll defer. Deferrals are usually incredibly difficult to come by. However, during COVID, the school said, look, we accepted you. You are unable to come to this country. We'll work with you, right? You can do classes virtually, or you can, again, we will defer you, and hopefully a year from now things will be better. So what I would tell people is, if you're still interested in coming to the US for graduate school, apply and then get in, and then at least you've got that acceptance in hand, and then you can try to work with the school to figure out some sort of a solution. And then the worst case is you say, well, I'm not going to pursue this. But if you don't apply, then you're definitely not pursuing it. You don't even have that option. So I would tell people to, maybe don't be dissuaded, because I think there will be workarounds somehow.
Yeah, and part of this is a deeply personal decision that every person has to make in terms of their level of comfort. And I'm part of one of these wonderful, weird American families where some of my own siblings are not American citizens. And so I had a conversation recently about with my sister, who's on a green card, that maybe she shouldn't go overseas to attend a wedding because coming back, like, it could just be a hassle that you don't need. And it is sad that these are concerns. What I will say, though, is that having worked at multiple universities, I feel certain that once you're at that MBA program, and even from the point at which you're accepted, all of the schools are going to work exceptionally hard to do what they can to get you there, to provide you with a really great experience. They understand the broader world. Certainly Harvard, where I used to work, has now sort of become the face of attempting to protect students and what they see as the academic experience. And so that part of it, I think that you will have a fantastic experience within the four walls of the campus. All the other stuff is a much more complicated decision. And it is, a decision that, like I said, we're still trying to figure out the data for it. Like, what is the immigration process going to look like? H-1B visas were a big political thing. I guess it was like a month ago. Feels like, the last 3 months have been 5 years, but you just don't know. And so the difficult part of this is, and it kind of cuts both ways, is that one of the interesting things about an MBA is it's not like other professional schools where if you want to be a doctor, you have to go to med school. There's no, oh, let me just go out and do some operations and figure it out along the way, right? Law school, the same way. You have to go to law school. Here, it's a different kind of decision. And so maybe the calculus about waiting versus action is more complicated because you do have a bit more flexibility. But it's also the case that I'm always loath to tell people to avoid, or rather, I tell people to avoid trying to time the market, so to speak, or like figure out this is the exact year because applications are going to be up or down. Most of the decision, not all of it, and certainly in this case, I would maybe put an asterisk there. Most of the decision, I think, is about your personal, professional, and kind of personal journey and how you see an MBA changing that. And those basic metrics are still the ones that should decide whether or not and when you make the decision. Because you talked about the economic question, and it's probably the case. So right now it's 50-50 whether there's going to be a recession based on the best models. But a recession would probably mostly impact 2026 admissions, because it tends to be that, even for an MBA, it's something that people plan for a little bit longer. It's not often that someone says, although it does happen, 3 weeks before the deadline, hey, I should get an MBA, right? It's something like, I'm going to study for a while. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to investigate the schools. And it's usually like an 8-month to 12-month process where they're really kind of digging in and they decide to pull the trigger. And so I guess that's all a big way of coming to the question, which is, do you have evolving thoughts on how people should decide within kind of an uncertain moment whether and when and how they should approach this MBA application season?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head a second ago when you said don't try to time the market. If you were going to apply this year anyway, before all of these different, variables suddenly started becoming so crazy, I say just go ahead and apply anyway. Maybe some of the things that we think are going to happen won't happen, or maybe some of them will, but at least, it's better to have the option in your hand and then decide what to do with it than to put yourself out of the running completely by not even trying. And then what happens if all of a sudden they decide to triple the H-1B program? I don't think that will happen, but at this point, things are so chaotic that, wow, then you'll look really prescient and you'll look like really wise for having applied this year. I just think if you were going to apply anyway, just continue with those plans, and then just have faith and confidence in yourself that you and the schools will be able to figure something out should you get accepted.
Yeah, that's where I land on it. And again, I cast no aspersions on someone who feels like, it's kind of region specific too, if we're being blunt, that, do I want to come to the United States? It's also the case that there are wonderful business schools overseas that you could investigate, INSEAD or Oxford Said, whatever it is, there are tons of great options there if it's a genuine concern.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last thing that we want to talk about is AI. And as someone who not every year, the last 2 years, but mostly the last year, reads hundreds of personal statements, let me begin by saying, before we get into the news, that it is very easy. It is very easy to tell when an essay has been written by AI. And even if you go through it and you feel like, oh, this is really great, it sounds like a person. When you go through the process of reading essays, you're like, oh, and it's not just things like the M dash that everyone talks about that are kind of the telltale signs. You can tell. I would bet you a steak dinner that you could give me the Pepsi challenge where you give me 5 human essays and 5 AI essays, and I could tell the difference. And admissions people who read, again, hundreds of these things, you will start to notice that there's a difference. So the news, though, is that last year, there wasn't a ton of clear guidance from MBA programs about how and whether you could use things like ChatGPT. They kind of fell under the broad umbrella of their plagiarism rules. I had a conversation on one of the GMAT events with the director of admissions at the University of Michigan, which is my old alma mater. And she said, part of it is just the technical question of, it's a big thing to ding somebody and say, like, this is AI, when you're not confident that you actually have the technology to for certain say that. But part of it is just kind of assessing the landscape and figuring out what it is that you want a personal statement as an admissions committee to be and do. And what do you think, kind of about people's use of the technology? All that being said, Columbia has, for the first kind of major school, I think, to really lay out a clear policy about AI. And my guess is that most schools, many of the top schools, will have clearer guidelines going forward. And it mostly focuses on the basic gist of it, and you can read this on Columbia's website, is that what is okay is to use it for things like idea generation, but they don't want the Chat GPT or any of the generative AI technologies to create the text, right? That's the line that they're drawing. I'm sure that you encounter Chat GPT to some degree or another. Do you have thoughts on like how you guide people about Chat GPT, whether it's useful, how it's useful, et cetera?
Absolutely. So, your comment about how you can, if you're an experienced essay reader, you can absolutely tell. It reminds me of even before AI existed, when people would try to write their own letters of recommendation and submit it, and they would think that they were being clever, and they're like, "Oh, but I changed it." And I'm like, to you, it seems like the letter of recommendation that you wrote for yourself is very different, but that's because you don't do this day in and day out. For those of us who do it, it becomes very clear, like, oh, you wrote your own thing. So it's the same thing with AI, right? If you're not used to reading essays day in, day out, you might plug your prompt into AI and it spits out an essay and you think to yourself, this is gold, this is fantastic, submit. And not realizing that it is actually pretty obvious that a machine wrote it and not a person. It's interesting. So each year I attend a conference with admissions officers. It's for MBA admissions consultants and MBA admissions officers. We meet once a year to discuss what are we seeing in the marketplace. And last year, the AI policies, it was a little bit of a wait and see approach. You're right. We're not really sure what this means. Some people were saying, well, is it really that much worse than spell check? As long as everything that you're saying is true, where's the line between using, say, spell check or Grammarly to check your grammar versus an AI that writes? So I do think that, Columbia is the first, and I think there are going to start being more and more stringent regulations put out against this, because at the point where it stops being authentically about you and who you are as a person, then you're actually robbing yourself as an applicant of an opportunity to make that real human connection with the reader on the other side. So I actually think you damage yourself if you use AI, even if you didn't get caught, even if you could quote unquote get away with it. I do not recommend using AI, because there is that, in our sort of pre-podcast chat, you use the term uncanny valley, I think. And that's it. You can just tell. And wow, what a wasted opportunity, because at the end of the day, they're accepting you as a person, and you need to use the essay to create that human connection, and you as a human trying to reach out and get the human on the other side reading that essay to root for you. And so I believe that even if you could get away with it, which I think the schools will increasingly start frowning upon it, but even if you could, I think you're doing yourself a disservice to have a robot write what should otherwise be a human essay.
Yeah, and it's not something that maybe someone who's applying to 20 schools and they're feeling the crush of work wants to hear, but the work and the headache and the sweat and the tears that goes into making a great personal statement is the thing ultimately that's going to make it really good. And so if I'm sitting and I'm talking to someone, there's a couple of dynamics that happen when I'm trying to help them write a strong personal statement. One is that a lot of times people don't know what's interesting about them, and just kind of they'll say things in passing and you say, wait, stop there. Expand on that for a second, right? So that's one of the things. But it's also the case that writing an essay, part of it is figuring out what's important in the essay itself. And in the context of admissions, that means figuring out what's important about your life and how you're positioning yourself. And if you just, put your CV into ChatGPT and say, write me a 500-word essay, it'll do it. But it hasn't done the work of figuring out, here's why I'm actually different and unique, and here's why the journey that I anticipate going on, that I hope to fulfill, is important and interesting. That's kind of the first part. The second part is, it's kind of a weird analogy, but I remember once talking to my mom. She said, Tom Cruise is a very handsome man. And I said, he's got a weird nose. And she said, yeah, but like everyone who's really attractive usually has something that's just a little bit off about them. And there is some charm in an imperfect personal statement. I'm not telling you to sprinkle in spelling mistakes or anything like that, but there is like some humanity in this. Isn't this clean, antiseptic, anodyne, whatever word you want to use, essay that just seems, I don't know, like the floors of a hospital, cleaned with antiseptic and under fluorescent lights. There's got to be a little bit of grime and mud in there for it to feel like a person. And ultimately, like, I think it's hard when you're reading a lot of essays. What you want to do is feel like I am having a moment with you through the essay, and moments of connection are ultimately the thing. Because having sat in admissions rooms, you a lot of times will use shorthand to talk about someone. So, you say, hey, what did you think about the Peace Corps guy or whatever it is? And that depends on like you being able to stick something in someone's head in a human moment. And right now, and who knows, maybe in 2 years, like ChatGPT will be better at this, but right now it's not there. And that human connection just isn't present.
That's absolutely right. And I would even take it a step further. I think people who are new to the process severely underestimate the importance of likability. So it's not just about feeling human or seeming human through your essay, but actually becoming likable. And so that's why sometimes, to your mom's point about Tom Cruise, sometimes those little moments of imperfection actually make you more likable, because the admissions officers are human too. The admissions officers have faced failures too. I remember once one of the former heads of admissions at Columbia talked about how she had been laid off at an earlier point in her career. And so sometimes candidates will say like, oh my gosh, I was laid off from a job. Does this mean that my life is over and my MBA chances are over? No, the people on the other side who are humans, they themselves have faced setbacks. They themselves are not necessarily perfect writers. So absolutely, I think polishing it so much that you scrub it clean and you sanitize it too much, again, I think it's counterproductive.
And the other part that I would just add on as like a little quick postscript is you do want to make sure for schools that have interviews that it seems like the same person. And again, like if it's artificially generated, it's much more likely that it'll feel like, oh, I was super excited to talk to Maria, but this doesn't seem like Maria that, was in the essay. It seems like a different person. And that type of incongruity can cause problems.
And I think this is why one of the trends that we have started to see and will continue to see more of perhaps is the spontaneous video essay component of the application. The situation where you might not know, sometimes in advance what the question is going to be, but usually you don't know exactly, and a prompt will flash up on the screen and you've got 20 seconds to think of an answer and then 90 seconds to give your answer. I think that since those moments are a lot harder, at least as of right now, they're a lot harder to fake. Keep that in mind, that there also needs to be a consistency or congruency in terms of the person who you are in writing and the person that you are live. And this also applies to your recommendations too, right? Don't, if your recommender is going to sing certain of your praises, and say, oh, he's so great at X, Y, and Z, then don't say in your essays, well, my real strengths are something completely different, right? Like that, it then at that point, even if you're a strong candidate, it starts to call into question, like, are you just pretending to be someone that you think I want to see? And that's not what they want. They want to know the real you. So.
And I will say, having been negative for the last 5 minutes, if there's an upside to this, I think that it is that schools are going to start to be a little bit more thoughtful about what they want the personal statement to be. I was talking to a friend who's a writing professor at Harvard, and he was talking about how so many of the programs now are using the old blue books, right, for essays, which was a thing that I remember, but I just don't get used anymore. And it's because, look, we just have to move to non-technical means. To force people, because we care about how people think about things. And, for years, and I don't know if you've had this experience, when you see from year to year, like what the school's essays are, and like some schools will just keep the same one over and over and over and over. And maybe it's because they're happy with it. Maybe it's because they're just like a little bit lazy and they're not extremely thoughtful. But when you see a school change and you think about, okay, what are they trying to do with this new prompt? that can be a lot of times kind of refreshing in terms of how you think about that school and the thoughtfulness that they put into their applications, because an application should obviously attract and kind of reflect the kind of person that you want to come to your school. And so now there's the trickier question of what is a personal statement. Is it just like a narrative version of your CV? Do you care about how well they write? Is it like all the questions that you didn't have to answer when there wasn't this tool that could just give you the narrative version of the CV? And so the more thoughtful I think admissions setups are, the better they're going to be able to tailor classes to exactly what it is that they want from students.
Hear, hear. Let's hope that this leads to some better essay prompts out there.
Yeah. All right. Every week, we're going to be doing some lightning round questions where Marie and I will take questions from users and from the forum. Today, we have 3 questions. Our first question is submitting on the final day of the deadline a red flag?
I do not think it is a red flag. I would not advise it, though, just because, those momentary file uploads, heaven forbid that your internet goes out or there's some sort of connectivity issue. So I don't recommend submitting on the last day, but I don't think admissions officers have enough on their plate to worry about. I don't think they're obsessed with the timestamp of when you submitted. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, part of it is just how these files actually get transmitted to the admissions committee. It's not like they're put in order. The thing that I would say is the thing that led you to want to submit it on the final day is maybe the bigger red flag, like a personal red flag. You should try to plan it out a little bit better so that you don't have disasters that happen the last day. As a former professor, it seems like everyone's upload issues were always a challenge. So don't put yourself in a position to have to attempt to contact the admissions committee and tell them, hey, I lost a file, help. You don't want to do that. Question 2. Is it okay to draft bullets for my recommender?
I mean, my take on it is not only is it okay, but I think it's something you should absolutely positively do because number one, you want your recommender to be hitting the same points and complementing the story you're telling about yourself. But also in an indirect level, the recommendation is an exercise in you proving to the admissions committee that you are able to influence people over whom you have no formal authority. So if you submit a recommendation that goes totally rogue or that is off the rails, not only is that damaging because of the content, but it's also damaging because it makes you seem like someone who doesn't know how to manage upwards. What do you think? What do you advise?
Yeah, so the first thing you want to know is that the person can actually write a strong letter of recommendation for you. And again, in my past as a professor, I have had people who come to me and said, will you write me a letter of recommendation? And the first thing I will tell them is yes, but it will either be a strong one or a not strong one. I can write a letter that says, Johnny worked for me from this date to this date. He had no arrests and no disciplinary issues. Signed, Brian Fobi. That's very different than someone coming to me and I say, yeah, let's collaborate on making this a strong recommendation. If you give bullet points, that's great. I even appreciate if you give me a sample draft version of your personal statement, because I can then try to tailor some of what I write. And really, if there's something that you think that you did that was really important and really impactful for the company or the organization that you want me to talk about, then it's really useful for me to know. And so absolutely take an active role in making sure that the person crafts a strong letter of recommendation for you. And the last one, is Grammarly a disclosure-worthy AI tool?
That's a great one. I don't think it is, only because it's been around for so long and they didn't seem to have a problem with it in the past. It wasn't until the more generative AI, maybe that's where the line is drawn. Maybe Grammarly takes your existing stuff and tries to make it nicer, but it doesn't invent the essay for you. And so maybe that's where the line is drawn. I don't know. What do you think?
I think the first thing is you want to make sure, just by checking with the school, as more schools publish their policies, the default answer for me is going to be no, it's not a problem, because it's sort of a more robust version of spell check, and I don't think anyone has a problem with that. The issue, if you want to have a line, is when you go from helping you craft or refine text to writing it. And so this is simply something that tells you, look, you split an infinitive or whatever. They will also give you some style advice, but to me, it doesn't rise to the level of needing to disclose it. But again, make sure that you check on the school's website to make sure that it's not something specifically they say you have to disclose. All right. Well, so those are the big 3 things that we're going to talk about this week. Maria, is great talking to you. And people can find you at Applicant Lab. And it's a great time for everyone who's out there thinking about the 2025-26 cycle. I think right now, early in the spring is when a lot of folks are out there really starting to put together things like their essays, their recommendations, maybe dialing in the tests that we talked about. You can find me at gurufi.com for help with your essays. Yeah, so I guess I should have written a fun and compelling ending, but we will be back. This is our maiden voyage, like I said, of the GMAT Club podcast. And so we will see you next week or the week after.